Hey there, welcome to First Look. Thank you for being here today. And if you're watching this, it means that you, like I, made it through Holy Week. And you know, we spend a lot of time in the church kind of joking about Holy Week, just as it's intense and there's a lot to it, and there's a lot of moving parts, and there's things that you only do in that time of year, and there's things that you focus on, and it kind of goes back and forth between joy and horror and somber and elation, and all those kinds of like waves of emotion. And you get to the end of it, and whether the end of it means the end of a service or the end of the meal you're hosting or whatever it happens to be, and there's kind of this relief. And then you get to Monday, if you're me at least, and you just kind of need a beat, you need a second. And I think that's when the all of what you're doing, I think, kind of hits you, or hits me at least. And when I say that, I mean there's I think your faith on some level should jar you. It is a lot of comfort, like what we do, how we approach faith, how we approach Holy Week, whatever it happens to be, should bring a level of comfort. Christmas does that, Advent and Christmas, that it does that, but it also should bring something that is jarring, is awakening, does kind of change your rhythm. And it's only once a year. What we kind of ask of ourselves in terms of the services that we attend and whatever, only happen in a very short amount of time, but they can have a lot of impact in the way that we prepare ourselves to be those people of faith, kind of as we move ahead. So I appreciate you all, kind of your feedback and your participation in your leadership and your service, to make all that happen. And I appreciate that a lot. So we get to this point in these weeks right here, and I feel like because we kind of rode this ride, these couple of weeks can feel like a time to reflect. You've got we have stories that we know. Jesus on the Emmaus Road, and he's talking to these seemingly random disciples about what had happened and transpired, and they don't realize it's Jesus, and then they do at the end. There's the doubting Thomas story. There's Jesus meeting the disciples on the beach and having breakfast, that kind of like grilling fish on the beach kind of story. And all of that leads us to the ascension. And so that time, there's a kind of rallying point where Jesus tells the disciples to make disciples of all nations. And then there's the ascension, and then it's Pentecost. And in the midst of that, you're kind of trying to figure out, well, who is the church now that, without Jesus here on earth? So I was kind of thinking about how that whole season, the season of Easter, going from here to Pentecost, here to Ascension, here to Pentecost, right? It's roughly, I can never remember the exact amount of weeks, but it's like almost 2 months in the next couple months between now and the beginning or end of May. And I always try to look at it from, what are some faithful ways of looking at that? Because ultimately, what Jesus has to do in that time period, once they get over the shock of the fact that he's actually here and it's actually real, and they have some kind of hope. It's clearly not going to be the kind of hope that they had prior to his death, but it's something else. Jesus has to kind of get them ready for that. They have to start thinking about where have they been? What did they miss? What didn't we see? One of the Sundays is traditionally where we talk about like Jesus as shepherd. And we kind of look backwards a little bit, after the first couple of weeks where we look at like the aftermath of, either Emmaus or Doubting Thomas. Besides those stories, we do a lot of kind of looking back and saying like, let's look at these stories. Let's look at who Jesus is, with resurrection as the backdrop. Like now that we know that resurrection has happened, how do we see these stories a little bit differently? Which again leads us to Ascension and Pentecost. Okay. So this year, I chose a version of that I think is a little different, but I think is still within the realm that you can get your head around. So we're starting a series here in the first few weeks after Jesus, where we're looking at the person of Judas very intentionally and specifically. And I want to tell you a little bit about why I chose that and where I'm headed. So a lot of this is going to be, I bumped my camera. A lot of this is going to be me trying to give you a sense of where we're headed. Okay. So Judas is one of those people who, of course, we paint with a very particular brush for good reason. But it kind of makes Judas into a caricature, I think. You've heard me talk about Doubting Thomas, right? Where I mentioned him a few times there. Well, Thomas is a lot of things, a lot of really amazing things. He doubted for a day, and that's what we call him forever. Now, Judas, any kind of ill will or finger pointing or head shaking or despising that we do of Judas for what he did to Jesus is all reasonable, right? That makes sense that we would do that. That is ultimately where he is in the history of faith. But is also, because he dies, there is no other redemption story. Like there's no story that kind of leads us, well, and then Judas did this, and then Jesus did this, and then, that part of the story doesn't exist. So he does what he does, and then he dies, and then that's it. Like we get to tell his story. He can't redeem himself or even attempt to. So we're left in the same way that we are left with Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is who he is to us. We don't know what happens with the rest of his story. And Judas doesn't have any other part of his story. So we're left with this last impression, which is him betraying Jesus. But there is a ripple effect to his life. And I want to explore that because there's two elements of it that I find fascinating and that I think have a real impact that I at least have not explored enough. The first is who he was before he made that decision to betray Jesus. He was a beloved, trusted disciple. If you think about all the people in the New Testament, all the people in the Gospels that we point to as being these faithful individuals, people that responded to God's to God putting his son on earth, right? To like responding to that idea. People who shared the gospel, people who were witnesses to miracles, people who received blessings. If we think about like Mary Magdalene or the others who came upon Jesus, or the woman at the well, or the Syrophoenician woman who calls Jesus out on inclusion, the centurions, or anyone that we point to, any of his disciples, because of course, being a disciple of Jesus is not just the 12. That's just the like the leadership. That's like the session, right? Being a disciple of Jesus was like, there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of people that were close to Jesus, or at least within his circle, right? This is just the inner circle. But Judas is one of the most trusted leaders of the Jesus movement, and for years would have been there and participating and listening to every single thing that Jesus did. He at no point, besides what the authors tell us, like, oh, and then there was Judas, the one who would betray him. Like, there's that kind of a whisper to the audience. No one in the group, as far as we can tell, there's no illusion that anyone else thought of Judas as different than them, right? Bartholomew and Judas are the same. You don't know anything about Bartholomew. You know the name, but you don't know anything about him. Judas was the treasurer. That's all we know, right? That's realistically, but we know what he was a part of. We know what he was a part of. And you wouldn't be in that position if you weren't trusted. No one else would have accepted him in that position if he wasn't trusted. So, and no one else was like, whenever Jesus says, one of you has betrayed me, it's not like they all said, oh, it was probably Judas, right? I mean, there's no hint. So I think that exploring what that betrayal must have felt like for the disciples is fascinating too. So not just, why is Judas chosen? What do we know? And what did that effect, what was the effect of the fact that Judas did this? How does that change the way the disciples think about themselves or the world or the church? Ultimately, this is what I'm going to. The church that they create. Does the betrayal of Judas change the way that they see or understand themselves, the world, or the church they would create? That's my contention. Because what I think is that you couldn't go through that experience of getting to the triumphal entry, right? Jesus is being Hosanna in the highest, right? Blessed be the one who comes in the name of the Lord. You can't get to from that moment to Maundy Thursday, where Jesus is washing their feet, including Judas. He's washing their feet. He's at the table. He's doing all. You can't get from that moment to Thursday, to Gethsemane, to the arrest, feeling all of the unbelievable things that they must have felt Friday and Saturday, thinking about Jesus, thinking about Judas, and then get to Sunday, and then everything that happens after Sunday, everything that happens from now until Pentecost, basically, you can't tell me that that action doesn't play some pivotal role in how and what they form afterwards. You can't tell me it didn't influence the kind of person that they hoped would, Matthias, who is the disciple that follows Judas, that didn't bear some measure on how they instructed him or what roles they gave him or how they saw him, right? Like what level of trust do they come into? What Matthias must have thought or felt as he's entering into that role. All of that plays in. I mean, think about the things in your life that play a major part. If you think about who you became as an adult or who you became in retirement or who you are, whatever, someone's illness, someone's death, someone's, some breakup, a divorce, something like that affected your life, right? You're a different person because of who your mom or dad was or ended up being, someone's disease or someone's death or someone's leaving or someone entering your life. Some big event like that changed the course of who you are. You are different because that person left or entered your life at some point. Some big move, some big event. It doesn't get any bigger outside of Jesus and the resurrection. There is no human response, human decision bigger than what Judas does. And so since that's true, how could it not influence and affect how the disciples went about their business of being disciples? And what role does Judas play in their lives leading up to that point? What kind of hole does his lack of presence leave? That's what I want to explore because I find it interesting, and I hope you do too. Which I'm also going to do this 4-part series on this Bible study. So Thursdays at 11 in the Berean room, starting this week, we're doing a study on Judas and kind of looking at this from a few different angles, week by week. I'm going to be using the passage I'm going to preach on that week and some other outside materials. There's some study materials, but also like something I'm going to give to people to kind of look at. So that's where we're headed. Okay. So that took me 18 minutes to tell you about. So let me give you the passage. It's a short text. It just sets all this up. It's sort of the beginning of a process. Okay. So this is Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 16. Okay. And it just kind of names the fact that this is where this starts. Okay. So Luke 6, 12 through 16. Now, during those days, Jesus went out to the mountain to pray. He spent the night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them. See what I'm saying? He called the disciples, chose 12 of those disciples, okay, whom he also named apostles. So then it goes through. Simon, who he named Peter. Peter means, in Greek, is Cephas, which means like the rock, okay. And his brother Andrew. James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, and then another James, who was the son of Alphaeus, and another Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Okay, now, something you should know. The name Judas is not actually unique because, so the name Judah, like the area or the tribe of Judah, like they're in Judah, the tribe of Judah, that word Judah, which is a name. In Greek, there's no difference. We say Judas just to make him distinct from Judah, the other Judah, the son of James. Okay. Judah, and so we could just say Judah Iscariot, but we say Judas because that makes a distinction between him and Judah. So anyway, my point is, Judas Iscariot, who we're talking about, his name is Judah. So anyone that you know named Judah, you could also call Judas if you want, because it's the same name in Greek. It's just we say another version of it out loud so that we know who we're talking about. Okay. So my point in kind of pointing that out, is that Judas was called in the same way that everyone else is called. And then the author adds that element. It's not like Judas or Jesus calls all of them and says, okay, now I've got the 12 of you, you're going to be a traitor, and then moves on, right? Judas is called in the same way that everyone else is called, right? They all come from varying backgrounds. They all have different skill sets. They all have different views of the world, etc. But they're all called. And it says he would become a traitor. It wasn't like he was already a traitor, like he joined the group, like he snuck in somehow, and like as some kind of sleeper cell. Like he didn't like infiltrate this group and like he was from some other party and like decided he wanted to come in and screw things up from the inside. Like that, he was called as a disciple. And so my first contention is the kind of the one, what does it mean for us to be called? And in comparison to where we end up. So one of the things that I find kind of fascinating is my assumption would be that many of the disciples, if not all of them, based on their reactions to things, based on the arguments they have later, is that the disciples, the 12 disciples, entered into this into this agreement to be those people because they assumed two things, two really important world-changing things. One, that Jesus was clearly special. I don't think that they understood he was, the Trinity, like that wasn't the concept that they're kind of working off of, but that he was not just some zealot or some prophet or someone who was a run-of-the-mill rabble-rouser, but that there was something special about him. There was something clearly charismatic that drew people to himself, that he could do things and said things that lit them on fire. And they were backing this person because they believed that if anyone could right the ship, rid them of the Romans, put the rightful people of Israel back into their place, and create the kind of promised land, Davidic, literally, Davidic realm that it once was. If anyone could do that, it was him. And they were willing to spend their lives doing that. So I think that was a commonly held, mutually held belief, because The reason I think that is not only because of what Judas does at the end, trying to make sure it happened, but also the disciples. Those stories where we see the disciples saying, "Well, I want to be on your left, and I'm on your right, and we're going to do this and that kind of thing." And the fact that they couldn't believe that he would die, right? Like none of those things came together because this was clearly the mission. The mission was turn the world upside down and then flip it back to the way it was supposed to be. And Jesus had a plan for that. And he kept using the kingdom of God, but like we all know what that means, right? And along the way, they learned things about what this kingdom would look like. He used all these analogies to kind of put it together for them, but they still knew it. Well, at the end of the day, we're still talking about the same thing, right, Jesus? Like it's like that kind of. And that's why my contention is that I honestly think that they all wanted the same thing, or some version of it. They all wanted a world that looked the way the thing they had in their head for what David's kingdom either was or could have been, where they could have been if they would have just stayed on that track. Because remember, by then, it's 1,000 years since David. David is just the stuff of scripture and legend at that point, right? Forgive me, it's Camelot in that sense. It's an idea, right? David's an idea, and they thought they were going to be a part of recreating that. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can be called to something, but still not really see where it's going, or get so lost that we forget the plot. So that's my thought for the first week. Okay, that's where we start. Well, thank you for doing this. Thank you for helping me. Thank you for getting through Holy Week with me. Thank you for making it what it was. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week. I hope that you can join us on Thursday at 11, and I will see you next time for another First Look. Take care.